Welcome, everyone. My name is Jenny Dodd. I'm the CEO of TAFE Directors Australia, and I welcome you to this afternoon's TAFE Talks. I particularly want to welcome Simon Walker, who is the Managing Director for NCVER in one of Simon's last public appearances as in his role as Managing Director of NCVER. I also welcome Craig Robertson, known to many of you, who's the CEO of the Victorian Skills Authority, and of course Mary Ferrone, who is CEO of Homespleen Institute and Chair of the TAFE Directors Board. This afternoon, we're going to hear from Simon in a very interesting topic around what has been the impact of the last couple of decades of vet policy on TAFE. So let me begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are part of today's seminar and who are part of the broader work that we do through TAFE, be it students, stakeholders, or most importantly, staff. So welcome to today's session, and please let's hear from Simon Walker, who was with us at the TDA Convention 2024 in Sydney at the beginning of May, where Simon was the second speaker on the team led by Mary Ferrone, arguing in the negative for whether TAFE is at the heart. On the opposition team to Simon was Craig, who led that team with two other esteemed people, being Verity Firth and Claire Field, known to many of you. There was so much interest in that session that we thought we really cut Simon short. In a debate, he only had 10 minutes. So today, what we want to give Simon is a good 25, 30 minutes to really explore this topic, which is around what has been the policy over the last couple of decades and what has that impacted TAFE look like. Today, Simon will lead us off on that 30-minute discussion, and then I'm going to ask Mary to respond, and then Craig to respond, and then we'll open to you, the audience. If you wish to pose a question, please put it in the Q&A, not into the chat, but into the Q&A. So, Simon Walker, thank you very much for joining us once again in a TDA event. Over to you.
I thought our trusted lieutenant who was driving the show was going to unmute me, but I've done it myself, so that's okay. So welcome everybody. As Jenny said, I'm Simon Walker, Managing Director of the NCVER for a little bit longer. And as Jenny also mentioned, this is a bit of a follow-up from the TAFE conference. So for those of you that were there, you're going to hear a bit of this again, but I didn't tell everything I wanted to say. So this is the long version of it. I'm going to share my screen, and I need someone to tell me that that's working. I think I saw a thumbs up from Jenny and a few other thumbs floating up the right-hand panel on my screen. So I am talking specifically around the impact of vet competition policy on TAFE's role as a public good provider. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and we pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging. But to start, we'll just have a little tour of history, and I've called this the competition policy timeline, but it's actually broader than that. Starting with what happened back in the early 90s around the Hillmore Report, which was the National Competition Policy Review, and COAG agreed to principles that emphasised national competition policy that will support an open, integrated domestic market for goods and services. Now, that particular piece of work wasn't focused on vet, and in fact it was more around transport and logistics and infrastructure, but the notion was that the provision of those services, instead of being by public providers, would go out to the open market for provision by non-government providers. One of the reasons I think vet wasn't in that original scope is that due to the Constitution, vet is the responsibility of states and territories, although as we've seen over the journey, even that's changed a little bit with the referral of powers for regulation. But At the same time, and I'm going to talk broadly around a period that sort of starts in the middle 80s or late 80s and goes through the 90s. So don't get too hung up on the precision of the chronology. But at the same time, we had ANTA being established. And really that was a consequence of the Keating government in particular looking to develop a national training system. So up until then, the training system was largely a disparate collection of 8 separate jurisdictions, states and territories, who all had their own systems, all had their own regulators, all had their own accrediting bodies and the like. But there was a mood, partly established through the Competition Policy Review, to have a national approach to skills. And one of the advantages amongst many was the notion of skills portability. So where we had someone trained in a particular jurisdiction, making sure that that credential was recognised in other jurisdictions was a key part of that drive. But some of the other subtleties in that was around establishing a demand-driven system. There was a view at the time that training was determined by the providers rather than the needs of the users. And so this notion of demand-driven started to bubble up at that time. And although I am going to focus specifically about vet competition policy, a range of other parts of the national system emerged during that period. So we had the first iteration of the Australian qualifications framework. We had a national set of standards for the development of competencies and ultimately qualifications. That then led to training packages, and of course training packages qualifications are by far and away the most dominant form of training and qualifications currently. So all of that came together at the one time, and the focus was on this centralised body, ANTA. For those that don't have the long history that most of us around the table do, that is effectively the forerunner for the Jobs and Skills Australia. There's been umpteen iterations of that since, although arguably ANTA had the widest scope and remit because it was also put in place with the agreement of all governments to monitor the performance of the system, including how funding flowed from states and territories and the Commonwealth. So it was arguably a slightly broader remit. But in essence, it was the forerunner for what is now Jobs and Skills Australia. And in particular, and this is where I'm going to focus today's discussion, was a national training system made up of a network of providers delivering nationally recognised programs. So that's the sort of the way the system was couched in terms of its national approach. Now, I use this at the forum just because I think it's an interesting observation, but I wouldn't get too hung up on it. But the language changed during that period, and it went from the national training system to a national training market. And of course, market connotes a whole range of things. And at the same time, TAFE became VET. Up until then, it was all about TAFE. That was the language that was used, and it became vocational education and training. And one of the first national strategies that ANTA produced was called Greater Responsiveness. And you'll see in the slides there, and in particular, it was to state and territory initiatives to allocate more funding on a competitive basis and will be expanded in 1995 and beyond. So that was the first formal expression of the notion of expanding the training market to incorporate non-government provision or non-TAFE provision. I remember I was in government just at that stage. That's when I got into government. And in 1995, by and large, jurisdictions were just dipping their toe in the water with a bit of limited tendering. It didn't have a huge impact at that stage, but the first systematic approach to progressing competition was user choice policy in 1998. And of course, user choice policy was around expanding the availability and the choice of provider for employers. So the demand was employer demand. And it gave rise to provision of apprenticeships and traineeships by non-government providers. I'll probably come back to this point. Throughout all the evolution of vet competition policy, it wasn't introduced in exactly the same way at exactly the same time in each jurisdiction. So when we say user choice policy began in 1998, there were plenty of examples of states not putting apprenticeships out to full competition in the first instance and taking quite a bit of time to work their way through that. Traineeships, I think, pretty much went out onto a competitive basis pretty quickly. But there are many examples of where jurisdictions didn't fully embrace the notion of full competition for apprenticeships, or at least took a few years before they got there. Having said that, that's now 20 odd, or nearly 30 years ago. And you could pretty much argue that it's a widespread policy setting throughout the country. The main point is it was scoped. So the first really systematic portion of the market was the apprenticeship and traineeship market. Now that's waxed and waned in terms of its total share of public funding, but it's in that 20 to 25% range of the total market that was exposed to competition. And then what I'm going to point out is that there have been progressive reforms under successive national agreements. Now, I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to go through the ones that I think are the most relevant. And they include a thing called the National Partnership on Productivity Places program in 2009. The Victorian Training Guarantee was a really key piece. And then, as probably most people would understand, the implementation of entitlement models. And the point I'm trying to make when I go through these is that this beginning scope that was subject to competition in user choice, which represented around about 20% of the system, and where choice was in the hands of the employer, gradually expanded to include non-apprenticeship and traineeship provision, and where the choice was in the hand of the student. So if I look a bit further into those ones, the National Partnership on Productivity Places program was a large amount of growth funding, and an extraordinary amount of growth funding in one hit, came in under the Gillard government. And one of the conditions of that agreement was that the additional places that funding generated had to be allocated on a competitive basis, and that would include non-apprenticeships and traineeships. Then at the same time, and this was a bit of a deal that Victoria did with the Commonwealth prior to entitlement models coming in more broadly across the country, the Victorian government embraced the full competition, demand-driven, uncapped user choice arrangement. And when I use the term user choice here, I'm talking about user choice for both employers and students, apprenticeships and traineeships, and what we sometimes call institutional delivery. And that's probably still today the most pure expression of a demand uncapped driven system that we've had. Again, there are calibrations though within these settings that don't mean that you can just do any course anywhere at any time, because the Victorian Training Guarantee was underpinned by a very clear policy direction that they wanted to upskill the workforce. So in the case of the Victorian Guarantee, despite its wide scope, you were entitled to do at least one qualification at one level, but if you wanted to do a successive qualification, at least when it was first introduced, you had to go to an AQF level above the one that you'd already completed. So that was the notion, was to encourage people to move up the AQF scale and be more qualified that way. That got modified over time. There were relaxations for young people and a whole range of other things. And similarly, the rest of the country embraced their entitlement models between the period of 2012 to 2014. Underpinning that was a national policy setting of an entitlement to a training place up to a Certificate 3. As it happened, each jurisdiction implemented that in their own way. We had, obviously the Victorians were already in place there. I know in Western Australia, because I was part of the bureaucracy at that time, we didn't have any restrictions on how many qualifications you could do, nor did it matter what qualification level you were at. However, the entitlement was only based on a relatively narrow range of qualifications that matched the occupations in demand. That started small and got gradually expanded over time. One of the reasons for that is that governments, treasuries in particular, get a bit nervous about saying a fully demand-driven system. It's not an open checkbook. So they put calibrations in that not only contain what could be unfettered growth, but also shape the training response to meet local policy objectives. So the Victorian Skills Guarantee and the higher qualifications is a really good example, and there are others around the country. Nonetheless, when you add the successive agreements and the gradual expansion that occurred through those arrangements, we now have a far larger proportion of the overall government-funded market that is subject to competitive processes. So, to return to the theme, and this really does follow on from what we had in the great debate, the theme is the impact of vet competition policy on TAFE as a public good provider. And this was about, is TAFE still at the heart of the system? And I think what most people would like to think that TAFE is still at the heart of the provision for disadvantaged students in regional and remote areas. It's a second chance institution. It's always there for those people that need a lift up, if you like, and for those people that didn't have the academic credentials coming out of school and the like. So when we did that debate, we came up with a little short list of criteria for what does it mean to be a public good provider. I've put 3 of them here on the slide here. They are not exhaustive, and I'm sure we'll have our own views or subjective views around what that might mean. But we talked about TAFE providing access and equity through its mission of public good, its reach through place-based campuses around the country, and TAFE as a provider of last resort where there is market failure. So the proposition is that the expansion of vet competition policy has negatively impacted TAFE in its role as a public good provider. So I'm going to put some data up now, and what the data is trying to show is what is the relative change in those attributes of public good provision. So for instance, for remote students or for students with a disability, relative to the overall change in TAFE's market share. So the proposition here is, well, we know that the TAFE share of the market has declined, but has it still retained, or at least largely retained, its share of provision in those critical areas of public good? I'll point out that there are limitations of the data. We've had umpteen changes of the Avimus standard, and we've got other series breaks within the data. So I've taken a particular period, which I think is quite robust, which is the period 2003 to 2022, but the data is still fundamentally representative at an aggregate level. So we start with the overall share. So this, as this graph shows that in 2003, TAFE was 76% of all program enrolments. And just to point out, the program enrolments are qualifications, skill sets, accredited courses and the like. They do exclude individual subjects, but they are by far and away the lion's share of all delivery, so over 90%. And it just made the presentation a little bit easier to do. And it shows that that's declined from 76% in 2003 to 53% in 2022, which is the last series of data I've got. Just as an aside, 2003 is 5 years after the introduction of user choice for apprenticeships and traineeships. So it is likely that TAFE share was a bit higher going back into the late 90s. And the other thing that might be of interest to people is that at that time in 2003, the biggest share of non-TAFE provision was community education providers or adult community education providers. Not far different from private providers, but that share of the residual, if you like, the 24% that wasn't TAFE, was pretty evenly split between community education providers and private providers. And although I haven't done any formal exploration of this in today's presentation, community education providers' share of government funds has declined a lot. So that share is probably down by about 80% compared to where it was in 2003. And of course, what we've seen is the rise in private RTOs during the same period. So that's our frame of reference, the decline from 2003 to 2022 of overall market share. And now I've got a few slides just to show, well, how does that compare in some of those other attributes of public good? So students with a disability. So what this graph is showing is that students identifying with a disability, TAFE share was 83% in 2003, and that's declined to 62%. And as you can see from the graph, it's a very linear correlation between the overall market share and the decline in students identifying with a disability. Same with First Nations program enrolments. So again, that's declined from 76% to 56%. And what that's saying is that the rise of non-TAFE providers they've also been increasing their services to First Nations students. And again, there's a very high correlation between those curves in those graphs. The other one was remote and very remote program enrolments. And this was one that kind of surprised me a little bit, because I thought that TAFE, with its place-based campuses all around the country, it may not be a place where private providers would necessarily go, partly because they're thin markets, and so they've got to watch the finances of that. We didn't have the classifications available until 2006. That's why the graph starts at 2006. But again, we see a decline where it was 87% of remote and very remote. And I probably need to explain, there are classifications for geography, metropolitan, outer metropolitan, regional, remote and very remote. And I've grouped up remote and very remote together. And you can see that the TAFE share of remote and very remote program enrolments has declined from 87% to 57% in 2022. And it was about at that point that I realised that there wasn't much point in going along every single metric that I had available to me. The pattern was reasonably clear. But I thought another one, and I will spend a bit of time on this one explaining this graph, is just the broader indicator of the cohorts that go to TAFE and to non-TAFE. And it's what they call the socioeconomic index of relative socioeconomic disadvantage. And so the ABS divides up the country by people in locations where each of those groups are grouped into what they call quintiles. And what it means is that 20% of people are deemed to be most disadvantaged based on their postcode, or at least their area code. And that moves up the scale to those that are least disadvantaged. And the general population has that, the way they've constructed it is it's evenly distributed 20% in each of those categories. So by looking at that relative to that line you can see across the graph, we can see, well, does the cohort that goes into VET, first of all, but also into TAFE and non-TAFE, are they representative of the overall population? Now, predictably, you would expect in those that are least advantaged that they would probably be less represented in VET, and I think the graph obviously shows that. And in most cases, you would expect those that follow or go into further education, more of them would go into university, and we know that from other research. And so it skews slightly towards the lower socioeconomic or most disadvantaged, but perhaps not as much as we might think. And what the other parts of the graph are showing is, well, what's TAFE's proportions compared to non-TAFE proportions? They are very similar, but as the data shows, arguably, well, not arguably, non-TAFE have a higher, or it's skewed towards more disadvantaged students than TAFE, but only ever so slightly. So that just is a broad-based indicator of the nature of the cohorts that enrol in VET and split between TAFE and non-TAFE. So the moral of the story is that competition policy, or at least that's my proposition, has opened up the market more broadly, and with that market has gone, if you like, a lot of the heartland that most people would associate with TAFE provision of services. It's not all bad news though. And so what I got here is one on TAFE's share of foundation schools program enrolments. Now, I've used a very broad definition of foundation. It is predominantly language literacy and numeracy, but it does include pathways programs, employment programs, and I think for the audience that's here today, you'll know what I'm talking about. And what you'll see here is that TAFE's share of foundation program enrolments has actually been maintained throughout that entire 20 years history. But what it actually does is reinforce the proposition, because the reason, or at least my view of the reason, of why that has been maintained is because governments made a conscious choice not to expose those programs to competitive forces. So whereas they've gone out to market on a whole range of other qualifications, they've decided, generally speaking, not to do that with foundation skills programs, in particular literacy and numeracy. So really it just reinforces that it's a conscious choice of government that has preserved that share, or TAFE share, of foundation program enrolments. And then another one, which I think is a good news story generally, but this came up in a webinar we did, I think, was it, Jenny, October last year, around the one tertiary sector. And the conversation was centred on the, has vet a good pathway for disadvantaged students to be able to go into university. And it built upon a lot of research back in 2008, 9, 10, which said it could be, but the problem is that, and I focused on First Nations peoples, is that First Nations peoples were by and large enrolled in lower level certificates, so therefore they couldn't articulate into a university because they needed to get to a minimum of a Cert 4 and probably a diploma, and they simply weren't enrolling in those courses. But there has been a lot of effort in policy and right across the board. The whole sector has obviously had First Nations training as a high priority for the last, well, for as long as I've been in the system. And so what this shows is the change in the profile, the AQF profile of First Nations students from 2010 to 2022. And it shows what a dramatic shift in the profile of First Nations students has been, away from those lower level certificates, which is the blue series in 2010, to the higher level certificates that you'll see in the orange areas in 2022. So that's a real success story, and one that I don't think is that well understood. And just to bring it back to the TAFE conversation, in 2022, TAFE delivered 2/3 of all the enrolments for First Nations people in Certificate 4 and Diploma courses. So in that sense, TAFE's very much a key contributor to that. I kind of speculated on why that might be the case, and while I don't have any definitive data to prove it or otherwise, but it might be a conversation starter, I suspect it's because of the scope that TAFE has. It's a very wide scope, TAFE institutes, and so the ability to scaffold through the system, I think, is probably easier through a TAFE institute. Plus, it's got its overall supports and the general sort of ability to be able to support students through their journey. It might be an interesting bit of research, because you can probably test that proposition by looking at whether they did actually come through the lower level certificates and end up scaffolding to the higher level certificates. But also, I think educational achievement of First Nations people has improved, and so they're more likely to enrol directly at the higher levels than they once were. So that's just to leave a slightly different spin on the TAFE contribution and its role in the public good provision. So I might just leave it at that, Jenny.
Thanks very much, Simon. As somebody said in the chat, a really good and interesting history lesson. So I'm going to ask Mary now to have some reflections on some of what you've presented. So over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Simon, for that presentation. It does follow on from our TAFE debate at the conference, where we were on the side of the negative side, saying that TAFE wasn't at the heart, and certainly some of that data does go to that. It's very sobering data, I think, for all of us at TAFE. But I'd just like to make a few sort of comments. Some of the history sort of brought back anxiety to me, having been in the system for some time. But I will say that, around 2013, 14, I remember being told, as were my colleagues here in Victoria, that we all should act more like private providers. I'll just leave that there. And you all know what happened after that. But it was certainly, you know, it's that sort of perception, I suppose, about TAFE versus what privates do. And it goes to your, I suppose, question, Simon, in regards to, you know, why marketisation came about in the first place. Was it to solve a problem of that we were perceived as being supply driven, when in reality we have a product that we can't change? It, you know, that certainly is from a supply side, but we run as businesses and it is very much a demand driven business as well. So it sort of goes to that whole question of what problem was any of the governments trying to solve with the marketisation, and that can be something that you perhaps comment on, and Craig as well. But I suppose the sobering aspect for me is that I sort of look at the data and think, why can't we compete? Why did we lose so much market share? And I think it's a really important thing that we in TAFE have to actually think about. But I think partly our cohorts have changed, and I noticed someone in the chat was talking about, whilst the foundation courses themselves haven't changed, we now spend a lot of time on foundation skills with our cohorts of students. So I would say that the cohorts have actually changed over time very much. Look, I'm sort of pleased that we're getting to rebalance, and here in Victoria since 2014, obviously TAFE has been back at the heart, and obviously at the Commonwealth level now TAFE is at the heart with the National Skills Agreement. So it's a real rebalancing of the policy, but I still, for me as CEO, you know, really think about why TAFE didn't maintain market share. I think it's a really important sort of question. And I also sort of note that Jenny told me yesterday that 95% of the income for private providers who have a government contract, 95% of their income is from the government. So in a sense, they're almost like a pseudo other government organisation. So what are we actually doing here if we're just propping up another government organisation? So really interesting data. I think it is sobering, and I think it does raise questions for us. Obviously, policy and politics does play into it. I think the rebalancing of the policy is in our favour, but I still cannot answer that question of why we lost so much market share. So I'm interested in other people's views around the table. So Jenny, I'll leave it there for now and hand over to Craig.
Thanks, Mary. We'll hand over to Craig, but Craig and Simon have been long-term colleagues in various roles that they've played over the years in terms of their positions in bureaucracies. They've both been Craig in the Commonwealth, and Simon was on the Senior Skills Officials Network from WA. When we set up the debating teams, we deliberately made sure that Simon and Craig were not together so that we got that sparring that they've had for some time. So Craig, over to you with some reflections on what Simon's data has shown.
Good on you. Thanks, Jenny. And it was certainly the case that my first engagement with Simon was across a table, me representing the Commonwealth and Simon representing WA. And I'd have to confess at that point, he won on that particular dialogue. I was a newbie to the vet system, and yeah, clearly I got my I was beaten well and truly. But thank you to Simon for those reflections. And it is quite true that sort of competition going all the way back to Hilma has sort of driven vet for a long period of time, along with new public management, which some people take back to Margaret Thatcher and to Ronald Reagan. You know, get government out of delivery of services, and a mixed market can do a better result. And I guess that leads me to sort of my first piece of reaction to this. Often those instruments or those policies were put in place on the assumption that we would get innovation and would drive quality improvement. And I'm pretty sure that's been the case, because I reckon I wrote some of those statements myself, that what would happen is we'd end up with quality improvements because providers would be competing against each other and the like. And we've seen that hasn't quite played out that way. And the other reason that we reckon that method was, well, that the entitlement came into play, was a sense of we've got all these programs clashing, and you could end up in one class with a student that was funded by one mechanism, student funded by another mechanism, maybe from a Commonwealth program and the like. And the sense was the entitlement, which with the student in charge, would be able to navigate their way through the system and would get rid of some of that complexity. Some of that hasn't quite worked out either, because of this concern around quality. And my sense around what happened was we then ended up competing on price and convenience. So the competition was on the basis of price and convenience. And what I mean by convenience, well, if you could get a qualification in a weekend, then that's what it was. And so therefore, TAFEs were being forced to say, well, I've got to try to compete on that same basis as well. And so what we've ended up with is, I think, a bit of a sense across the vet world that short form training is sort of the best way to go. And I think we're now paying that price as a country, and we've got to rethink that. A couple of other things I just want to add to the debate. One is, I think we should not lose sight of the fact that our vocational education and training system, and particularly the public good element of our TAFE system, is for what we would call is technology transfer. Now, I'm not meaning digital tools, I'm meaning the means of production of goods and services being transferred from one generation to the next generation, from one firm to the next firm, from one industry to another industry. That's our key role as vocational education and training. And we recognise by government policy that sometimes that fails because of self-interest and profit motives of firms, which is legitimate. That's what makes the economy drive. But what we're really trying to do is to say that's why we've got a public provider who can be the aggregator of that knowledge and skill, and then the distributor of that knowledge and skill. This is the key attribute about why we need TAFEs, strong TAFEs, particularly as we think about all of our industries changing and the sweep of technology that's going to come through our economy. And that's also the underpinning logic, from my viewpoint, around the TAFE Centres of Excellence. It's about TAFEs who can be the aggregator of where industry is going, what the skills are, what the underpinning knowledge is, and to frame up that knowledge and those programs so that more students can benefit from what we may want to call future skills. I do have some other views around how competency has led us down, but I'll come back to that later. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks very much, Craig, and we will come back to your views on competency. Simon, I think one of the observations that we can also have is in a market, and my first career was in marketing. You can control price, you can control product, you can control channels of distribution and promotion and so on, the 4 Ps of marketing, which are now extended with all of the online stuff. But when this marketisation started to roll through, we lost the ability to control product because essentially product became standardised. Do you have any reflections on how that might have impacted what we see in the data in terms of the drop in market share?
Yeah, well, probably to go back to Mary's question, well, why did TAFE lose this market share? And it is multifaceted. Craig has touched upon it, but from a slightly different angle. What's not said anywhere, but was absolutely a part of the thinking, particularly from the Commonwealth, but in some jurisdictions at some stages, was the cost. So the notion that it would be cheaper and more efficient, to use an economist's term, for private provision. And there is some substance under that. We do know TAFE is more expensive than private providers. So I think there was absolutely an economic rationalist approach to widening the market because they felt that the public provision was too expensive. To terms of why did it TAFE lose its share, particularly in those markets where things were regulated, in particular fees, and I'll come back to the effect of price competition in a second. My experience was, particularly with the Productivity Places program, where this enormous amount of extra money came in there, was that private providers were far more agile in terms of going out and drumming up the business. And I'm going to use a somewhat crude example, but camping outside of jobs, what we now call job services providers, and making sure that they could capture people as they were coming out the door, as it were. And I'm gilding the lily a little bit here, but they were very, very aggressive and determined to go and find those students in a way that probably TAFE wasn't. There has been, I think it's changed. I think it's a good thing. One of the, I think, benefits of competition is TAFE has changed, no doubt about it. Was that TAFE was a bit rigid in terms of, well, this is the courses you're going to deliver. These are the times they're going to be delivered to, particularly where it was a business-to-business transaction. So I think, private providers are just generally more agile and more determined to go and win that business. Like I say, that was then. I think that's probably changed quite a lot now. And certainly TAFE provision is a hell of a lot more flexible and responsive than it was when I first joined the system in 1995 or whatever it was. So I think that's part of it. I think one of them, and I had lots of discussions with a lot of my colleagues and people like Craig about the benefits of fee deregulation. And as someone who had a fair bit of influence in the WA system, I never went down that path. I just didn't think, I thought there was a race to the bottom if you weren't careful. And I think we saw examples of that in those jurisdictions that have deregulated their fees. Because in the end, if you're winning the business on price, and price matters to people, the problem is that your total revenue to deliver that service decreases if you're going to win the price on price competition, which means that the service necessarily isn't as well resourced as it would have been if it was a set price. And I always found it fascinating and somewhat perverse that the Commonwealth were a significant driver in competition policy, and yet a supporter of deregulation in general, and yet the university system, which is within their wing, is a regulated fee structure. So I'm not quite sure why that would be the case, but I suspect for the same reasons as I've articulated.
Simon, that's really interesting, and I do think the TAFE brand was used liberally, and to some extent continues to be used liberally by those who don't own that brand to be a mark of quality, and there's still a website out there that purports to be about TAFE courses, and yet there's no TAFEs at all that are offering TAFE courses there. So, that also, I think, might have been part of that. Simon, there's a question here from Paul Saunders around the problem, and it leads on really a little bit from what what you've been saying. The promises of neoliberal marketisation policies are lower cost, better outcomes. Do you think Australia has received these benefits from that, and is there any data to demonstrate that?
I think I'd call it a mixed bag, because there are always unintended consequences from significant shifts in policy. And I think when you go to any market, particularly a for-profit market, well, their motivation is different from a public provider who has, at least, if nothing else, their mission is to provide a public good. They're not there to make a profit per se. So I think you end up with some unfortunate unintended consequences. I'd like to think that we believe our own rhetoric and that that's a few bad apples and not general. And certainly my experience working with private providers in government was the vast majority of them were very dedicated to the cause. good quality providers. But a lot of it's open to exploitation if you haven't got the controls. And we talked a little bit about this the other day. The idea that you can marketize human services as if it was a pure free market is just absolutely wrong. And we've seen examples of that way outside of just the vet sector. I've noticed one of the comments talking about the NDIS, since that's a topical discussion at the moment. But there are plenty of other examples of where you really need to control what you're doing. You just can't let government money flow to opportunists. And I think that was some of the lessons we've learned over the last 20 years. I'd like to think we've got a bit of that right now. But as we know, there are other human services where we've got a bit of work to do to make sure that works. So I think, and I raised it in the introduction, we haven't really talked about it, but this notion of TAFE being around where the market fails, and having a presence in places, place-based presence, and continuity of services. I don't know if we've got time, but I might be able to briefly talk about a particular situation. I'm going to have to be a bit careful to protect the innocent here, but to give an example of what happens if you don't quite think things through. So it goes back to roughly a user choice policy, although it was well after that was introduced. And in Western Australia, Perth is 80% of the total population. It's a large capital city of 2 odd million people, and everybody else is spread across 1 million square miles in very, very thin markets. So you tend to find high cost provision centred in Perth, and I'm thinking the trades in particular, except TAFE, because TAFE provides those high cost services in regional and remote areas as part of its mission of public good. So I'm talking the trades now. Well, we had one significant, and I'll say up front, high quality provider, no issues with their quality, who are kind of keen to spread their wings outside the metropolitan area. So they thought that they would go down to our next biggest market, a place called Bunbury, a couple of 100 kilometres south of Perth, and establish an apprenticeship centre down there in this particular trade. They were also a group scheme. Anyway, they did establish themselves. There are about 100 apprentices in this particular trade in that region, at that time all going to TAFE. They set up, and within a matter of months, 90 of them had transferred out of the TAFE and into this private provider, which effectively cruelled the TAFE service. And so in the end, it was agreed that the TAFE would send the other 10 students over. And the point I want to try to make here is we went from a public monopoly to a private monopoly within that region for that particular service. After a few years, they called me into a board meeting and said, look, we're not quite making this stick financially. We think we need to get paid more. And I said to them at the time, and this is a bit off topic, but I was reviewing the prices and we'd probably look to make some adjustments, but we'd have to come back to you later in the year to formalise all that. Long story short is they couldn't wait. And later in that year, they decided to cease operations in that market. That was a few years after they started. And what that meant was 100 apprentices were without a provider. They were completely swinging in the breeze. Now, the consequences were they went back to the TAFE. They'd repurposed that facility. So a large government investment was required to actually get those 100 apprentices back into their trade training program at the local TAFE Institute. But it is a salutary lesson about privatising some parts of some markets. You've got to be really, really careful. And the beauty of TAFE is it's there. It'll be there tomorrow. It'll be there in 100 years, and it'll continue to provide those services. And I'm actually talking not just the continuity and the public good, but the fact that it's actually, in that instance at least, was more efficient if they'd left it there and not gone out to the private market and come back.
Yeah, because what you're talking about is quite a regional area, isn't it? So Simon, and indeed Mary or Craig might also be interested in this a response to this one. There's a question here from within the Q&A, and I do remind people, if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A, not in the chat. Could you please comment on the impact on TAFE of the rise in power and policy voice of industry and the corresponding lack of recognition of educators in policy decision making? I think that, and here, Craig, this might give you an opportunity to make the comments you're interested in making around competency. So we'll go to Simon first, and then maybe Mary, and then to you, Craig.
Yep. No
Oh,
worries.
I'm going to pass immediately to Craig on this one because this is, without doubt, dear to his heart, and I'm not going to steal his thunder on this one. This is great.
Mary, did you want to pass comment first?
Oh, look, I know that you'll elaborate far more eloquently. I will, Craig, on competency and what's been happening, but I think certainly when you look at industry, an industry-led system that we supposedly have, I think it's fraught with all sorts of problems, and those problems are bearing the fruit now in relation to the products that we have, the inefficiencies in those products and the inflexibility of those products. But then coupled with industry on one hand, in many cases saying that TAFE is unresponsive to industry needs. So for me, they can't have a foot in both camps of complaining about the provision, but also be responsible for the provision of the product. So I think we're in a real sort of dilemma at the moment in regards to product and in relation to the whole notion of industry-led system. But I will now hand over to you, Craig, to talk about it.
Yeah, good on you. Thanks, Mary. It would be useful for people to reflect upon the review that's been conducted in the House of Representatives about the Commonwealth Employment Services, really led by Julian Hill. And he makes a lot of reflections that employment services, which is the ultimate in contracting out of what was previously government services, has ended up being riddled with compliance and regulation and rules. And he makes this comment. It led from government mistrust of providers. It led to the imposition of significant over-regulation and onerous and costly accountability requirements, which further decrease the trust in the system. And led a lot of frontline staff being forced to focus on administration and compliance over supporting clients into sustainable employment. I'm sure if I took away the employment element and talked about VET, there'd be a fair bit of commonality in that. And so I do think where we are at is we have to reconceive our concept of competency. And I may well be shot for some of these comments, but I think in Australia, we've viewed competency from three perspectives, and then we interchange them, and then we're not quite sure why, but then we wonder why things go wrong for us. So sometimes we think about competency as an educational outcome, the performance of a task as defined by someone without any regard to input. Secondly, we view it as an effectiveness measure. In other words, if we get it right, if we know exactly what industry is saying and we train to that, we will be right and VET will be effective. But the most telling one is that we viewed it as competency as an efficiency measure. As soon as you're competent to what is a poorly defined educational outcome, and potentially what has been a best guess at what industry is needing, we only need to train just in time just for that particular skill. And that's our problem, that we've played around with competency and we're not quite sure then how to change that system. And I do want to refer you to a book, if you're interested in a book by Mark Carney, who was the head of the Canadian Reserve Bank and also the Bank of England. Particularly through COVID, he said we need to reconsider what we mean by value. Remember during COVID, where all of a sudden we were singing the praises of all of our nurses, our care workers, our cleaners, and things like that. There was a flip in public policy which said all we're worried about is the outcome, not necessarily the input. And as educators, we know that it's the input, the value of the curriculum, the enthusiasm and the skill of the teacher that makes the delivery on the ground real for people. That doesn't mean that industry doesn't matter, nor that competency doesn't matter, but we've got to flip our public policy narrative to have more concern about input, and that will then get us, I think, along the pathway to, to improving quality. And that's why we need a TAFE network, because it's in that TAFE network where we leverage and learn off the experiences of professionals, and that's the basis upon which we can trigger improvement. That doesn't mean that it's a TAFE only system. It's got what will happen through that model is there'll be spillovers. What TAFEs do, other providers can pick up, and that's the way that we'll drive to excellence and quality.
Jenny, can I just add something to that? And you were far more eloquent, thank you, Craig. But TAFE are often seen as sort of the end product of this whole system. So now you go deliver, and as Craig said, you know, we don't have a say in the input. And even though we're seeing real change in policy at the national level, I do note that, you know, the JSA, the advisory board, does not have providers on it. I know they have they do have experts, but they don't have the providers. And I think still the voice of TAFE as providers, as experts in education and training is still not being heard in the system.
Thanks very much, Mary and Craig. I think it's an interesting way in which you've expressed that, Craig, because I would say that by and large TDA's view around where we're heading is the importance of a first qualification is so important, because it is a bit about the inputs and the learning and the ability to succeed and the ability to stay the course to get some outcome, which turns me to the question, and this we've only got 4 minutes left, and we could probably go on here for a long time with such a rich panel, but I'm going to come back to you, Simon, because I think this one's for you. I'm interested in your reflections on the Australian Tertiary Education Commission and where you think that might go in terms of how some of what Craig has been talking about in terms of inputs or in terms of harmonisation of vet and higher education, TAFE and higher education. Some last thoughts for you, Simon, on what is a pivotal shift in policy that we find ourselves in the broader tertiary education context, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, nothing like a large question to lose. But I did look at some of the collateral, and you and I, Jenny, have been talking a little bit about this the last couple of days, of what will this beast, the Tertiary Education Commission, compose? What's its remit? What's its sort of totality of scope of services or whatever? And my first and instinctive reaction was I was a bit alarmed. This was the one commission to rule them all. And I think another body on top of a body on top of a body is not necessarily the ideal solution. So my instinct was, I don't think we want to have this super body somehow determining everything. That said, the sheer fact that it does encompass vet and higher ed could be useful for this, to crack this difficult nut around the intersection between vet and higher ed. And I'm just, by the by, I'm not personally wedded to the idea that they've got to become one and the same. I think they are quite different things and they should stay that way. But there could be a better way to communicate with each other, if you like, and certainly make it easier for users of the system to move in between. So I think that might be a benefit. But I don't know enough about what's really intended yet, other than some options that have been put on the table, one of which appeared a bit scary. And I think you've got to be a bit careful with those things. But completely off topic, I just want to respond to one of the Q&As. It took me a while to work out how that works. Who asked in the data that I was providing, well, what is the total numbers of enrolments over that period? Has that changed? And speculated that, well, if it's gone up, then perhaps just more people were familiar with going to private providers. And it is interesting because the total number of program enrolments in 2022 is exactly what it was, or almost exactly what it was in 2003. So it hasn't changed much at all. During that period, and it pretty much like still like a hill, it did rise during 2010, 11, 12 and 13. And for some of us, we know partly why that is. There was all sorts of policy settings around, for example, existing worker traineeships and a few other things that sort of inflated enrolments during that period. But really, nothing's much changed in terms of the total number of enrolments over that term. So, yeah.
So what we've done is really just shift where some of that delivery occurs, as opposed to grow the total part of the Australian society actually doing skills development and vocational education.
Yeah. I mean, the one other thing that a lot of people will tell you, and it's hard to argue in some ways, it's the notion of choice. Like having a choice is a principle in competition about where you go and the service that is provided. So Craig used the term innovation. I think that connotes a few other things, but certainly having more options in terms of the services that are being provided, notwithstanding the weekend diploma that you might get offered in some cases. But as a general principle, I think that's not a bad thing. So I think that's one of the objectives of it as well.
And this is probably where we'll end. As long as quality is maintained, and separately, we don't see what was evident in the great debate on your team, an erosion of integrity, because there is a quick buck to be made in a system that has allowed some of that to get in, quick buck, get out. And that's not what education should ever be about. It should always be, as Craig was talking about, a real focus on inputs and development that allows people to succeed, be that competency or not. It's a focus on input and development for outcomes. I'm going to close it there because we're 1 minute after 3 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time. I want to thank Mary Ferrone and Craig Robertson for joining us on this panel. I want to wish Simon Walker well. I'm sure we'll see you pop up again as you exit in the sector somewhere. But thank you for your contribution, Simon, over the time you've been Managing Director of NCVER. And thank you for sharing some of your thinking with TAFE directors and all our audience today. We really do appreciate it. So thanks very much, Simon, Craig and Mary. Bye for now.